Good evening, and thank you for joining us for tonight's program presented by 64 Parishes and the Louisiana Endowment for the Humanities. I'm Willie Mount, board member and past chair of the LEH, and it's my pleasure to introduce What's at Stake, a conversation on culture and the changing coast. Since its debut in 2018, 64 Parishes has explored the critical questions facing all Louisianians as we grapple with increasing environmental threats to our ways of life. From the magazine's regular coastal impacts column to longer features like the winter's cover story on the recovery in Lake Charles, 64 Parishes is committed to engaging in and promoting dialogue on the history, culture, and folkways that shape South Louisiana. Before I turn the conversation to our panels, I've been asked to share a few housekeeping points. Today's conversation is being recorded and streamed via Facebook Live using your Zoom webinar. If you have a question you'd like answered during the question and answer period, please use your Q&A function. The Q&A icon is located at the bottom of your screen, and you can type your question there. We have reserved 15 minutes at the end of the conversation for audience questions. We also have enabled closed caption for today's program. To activate closed captions on your device, locate the closed caption icon marked CC in your Zoom toolbar at the bottom of the screen. Click it and select Show Subtitles. Now it's my pleasure to introduce the moderator for today's program. Dr. Megan Poole was born and raised in Grand Lake, a small town south of Lake Charles, Louisiana. She's an assistant professor of English at the University of Louisville, where she specializes in rhetoric and science and technical writing. Poole is also part of the Public Health Literacy Group, a coalition of community leaders, grassroots activists, and academics focused on making the science of air pollution more accessible for residents outside of chemical facilities in Louisville, Kentucky. Welcome, Megan.
Thank you, Senator Mount, for the warm introduction. Thanks also to the teams at 64 Parishes and the Louisiana Endowment for the Humanities who made tonight possible, especially Aaron and Claire. Above all, thanks to all of you in the audience for joining us tonight. I wish we were in a room together so that I could see your faces. Also, selfishly, if we were in a room together, I'd probably be in Louisiana right now. I'd watch you shift in your seats if something made you uncomfortable. I'd watch you lean forward if you really liked something that one of our panelists had to say. Because I can't see you tonight, I need to hear you. At the bottom of your screen, just like Senator Mount said, there's a Q&A button. Please, please click that button and use it tonight. We're here to talk about Louisiana culture and how it might be changing. I don't think you'd be here tonight if you didn't have thoughts, ideas, and important questions about this topic. I'm going to kick things off here in just a little bit and introduce our panelists. I'll pose a few questions, but then we're going to have plenty of times to hear from you. You might have a question for all of the panelists. You might have a question for me. You might have a question for one of the panelists specifically. So please, please let us hear from you. Now, for the main event, a conversation about culture and our changing coast. You know, as a professor of English, I've spent the better part of a decade specializing in stories, figuring out how stories make us who we are, how stories teach us how to be good to one another, hopefully. Because I was born and raised in Grand Lake, I grew up on hurricane stories. When I was young, it was mostly stories of Hurricane Audrey, an epic storm that hit our coast in the 1950s. The year Hurricanes Katrina and Rita changed the history of our state, really the history of our nation, everyone assumed that we had seen our epic storm, the Audrey of our lifetime. But then 3 years later, another big one came. At first, folks decided to build their houses higher, invest in sturdier shutters. But then another one came, and then another one came. In just the last 2 years, communities across the state have endured 8 named storms: Cristobal, Laura, Marco, Delta, and Zeta in 2020, and Claudette, Ida, and Nicholas in 2021. So now, people across coastal Louisiana are facing decisions they never expected to make in their lifetimes. Do they stay or do they leave? Regardless of how they answer that question, how is the place they've known and loved for generations changing? And how are we and our cultures changing with it? Before we move into the panel discussion, I'd like to share a short video segment that might get some of your questions turning, which was produced by 64 Parishes. And these questions come in the wake of Hurricane Ida.
Zoom in on the tree. It's beautiful, you know, but if you know the story, it's sad too, you know. But it's, you know, it's fought back with everything it's had, you know. Come on in. And as you walk in, you're going to feel my foundation actually shifted. My walls broke away from the posts here and from the floors and everything. This shelf right here cracked. You can see the cracks at the doorways and here. And you go up and down. And you're going to feel it as you're walking through. I can remember preparing to evacuate and knowing that the hurricane was coming to this area, not knowing if it was going to be west of us or to the east. And, you know, going to town to get supplies or whatever. I said, maybe I should be taking pictures of what it looks like, you know, now in comparison of what it could be like when we come back. And I regret to this day that I didn't do that, you know, because that's, you know, our history, community of Bayou Dulorge, you know, gone. And, you know, they're not going to rebuild those, you know, that lumber. I mean, blood, sweat, and tears went into that, you know, harvesting the cypress trees, you know, in the local areas here. So, you know, like I say, a lot of history lost right there.
We're on High Ridge Plantation. We're standing in front of the site where the 1870s, 1880s Scotch-English barn was constructed. There was a unique construction that it was made with all timbers, saplings, etc. There were no machined wood, if you will, in the barn. So it has completely demolished and you would never know. So another instance where history has disappeared and not to be replaced. This is the Frederick's sugar mill, what's left of it. It wasn't in great shape before. It last produced syrup probably in about 20 years ago. But the family has been here since the 1870s, 1880s. This was originally a sugarcane plantation and subsequently a big rice farm. But this is all that's left of the last syrup producing mill on Bayou Dulorge.
It's going to hurt us as basket weavers, you know, and I have to make time to weave again, you know. There's so much to do with this house as far as emptying it and moving on. You look at the communities, you saw the damage, and you have to say, who's coming back? I'm not one to say you have to come back. That's a personal decision there, you know, but I can tell them as a traditional bearer that it's important that you learn your culture, learn how to weave the basket. That's kind of like our identity there, you know, as basket weavers. You know, the Houma people are known for the palmetto baskets. So, like I say, it's important that they learn about the rich history that we have, how to use the materials we have down here, because like other tribes throughout the country, you make use of what you have around you. It's hard, you know, as a community to see all the damage out here. Some of my roof is across the bayou over there, but I'm not the only one. We all in that, you know, like the song says, all in the same boat right now.
You heard Jamie from the United Houma Nation say, we're all in the same boat. We may all be in the same boat, but as she also shows, the stories we have to share and the experiences we've had that brought us into that boat together are quite different from one another. Tonight, we celebrate that difference with an incredible group of panelists who are coming into this conversation from different perspectives and different parts of our great state. If you wouldn't mind, Claire, show the map that I have. I want to introduce all of our panelists by showing you which panelists might be closest to your area. Also see that this map from KALB of Baton Rouge shows the projected loss of coastal wetlands, highlighted in red, in the next 50 years if nothing is done to restore the coast. Our first panelist with the green pin is Joy Banner from Wallace, Louisiana. Joy's an expert in communication and media studies, an area that's close to my heart. She received a PhD from LSU and taught business communication at various universities in Austin, Texas. Now she serves as Director of Communications at Whitney Plantation, where her great-great-grandmother was born into slavery. She has much to share with us about the future of tourism along the Louisiana coast. Joy's also leading the charge in shifting the story about Whitney Plantation, from a story that's predominantly been about John Whitney, the white plantation owner, to the stories of people who were enslaved and who built the place. Along with her twin sister, she runs the Descendants Project, a nonprofit that supports descendants of people once enslaved in the river parishes. Second, with the blue pin, is Jonathan Foret from Chauvin, Louisiana. Jonathan grew up working on shrimp boats and speaking Louisiana French with his grandmother. He's now executive director of the Wetlands Discovery Center in Houma, as well as a member of the Bayou Culture Collaborative, a group that's searching for resilience strategies and tactics of cultural preservation as people are moving up the bayou due to extreme weather. As Jonathan puts it, science talks a lot about coastal erosion and the effects of climate change on the land, but those papers don't often talk about how those changes are endangering the rich cultures born from that land. Third, with the orange pin, is Eli Langley, a member of the Coushatta Tribe in Kinder, Louisiana. Eli recently graduated from Harvard University, and he and I joked that he might be the first person from all of Southwest Louisiana to ever make it to Harvard. But he's definitely the first person ever at Harvard to master a Native American language as a second language. For years, Eli has worked on the Kawasati Language Project to preserve the language of the Coushatta tribe. He has much to share with us about the role language and stories play in preserving culture. He's a storyteller, activist, writer, and host of a new podcast we should all check out called Bayou Indian Radio. Finally, with the purple pin is Dr. Keagan Lejeune of Lake Charles, Louisiana. Keagan's a professor and head of the Department of English and Foreign Languages at McNeese State University. He has formerly served as the president of the Louisiana Folklore Society and editor of Louisiana Folklore Miscellany. Keagan's renowned for his research in folklore and his writing about no man's land along the Sabine River, as well as the lore that surrounds the Chenier Plain and Cajun Prairie. Recently, we've talked about the traditional ecological knowledges that risk being lost along coastal Louisiana. Thanks, Claire, for sharing that map. Joy, Jonathan, Eli, Keagan, it's such an honor to have you all gathered here tonight. If this panel is about Louisiana's coastal culture and how that might be changing due to extreme weather, the first thing I think we need to hear from you tonight is, what is Louisiana's coastal and river culture to each of you? What's worth saving? And this question's directed to all of you, so you all feel free to jump in.
Well, I'll start. Maybe we're all too polite to kind of start, so I'll jump in. And I would say that, I think the easy answer is that for the second part is everything's worth saving. I think most people would say that we want to save as much as we can. I think the difficult thing is how do you do that facing what we're facing? But I think really for me, when I think about the coastal culture and Louisiana's culture in general, I would say that one thing that we have to realize, it's not just monolithic, right? It's not just one thing. So one thing that I've realized is that every place you go in Louisiana, the culture there is unique. And that's what I think is part of what we need to remember when we think about saving, especially the coast, because sometimes we think about this place as the same from border to border, but it's not.
I'll go next.
Y'all really are polite, let me say.
Just thinking about the various coastal parishes, I think, growing up, I'm about 30 miles away from the coastal parishes. I spent most of my time in Lafourche and Terrebonne parishes because that's where we would go shopping on the weekends. That was the closest place for us, and we'd have to pass through the bayou to go to Thibodeau and go shopping. So I have a very warm just feeling in my heart when I think about Thibodeau, because it for me, it conveys times of me, my twin sister will wake up at Saturday morning, watch our cartoons, and then go shopping with my mom and my grandmother. But other than that, the coastal parishes, I think always the association with water and how much the water formed their culture and how much the culture was just infused with the different aspects of the waters and the bayous and all. And I just always felt like the sense of nature to me always came, it was just very primary when thinking about these places. And also too, and coming from a place that's a rural parish, the ways in which people tend to look at these parishes, coastal parishes, and because, we, I'd say, have a way of life that's more attached and infused with nature, that the prejudice that comes along with it. Like, there is a belief that we decide not to progress because, we understand that development could, we understand the development on our landscapes. And so that change doesn't necessarily mean progress. And so ways in which, like we have a very organic living and living off the land, how sometimes that gets sets up as people are, your back of the woods, your country bumpkins, your stump down is a word that a term that I hear a lot in Louisiana. So yeah, just I've always appreciated that relationship that these communities have with nature, but I understand that it doesn't get sometimes perceived that way.
For me, I identify as a Cajun man that eats too much. So when it comes to culture, mine kind of revolves around food a lot. And so because of Hurricane Ida, my mom's house took on a lot of damage. And so she's living with me now while we put her house back together. And I have enjoyed it more than I anticipated for multiple reasons, but one of the reasons is because she cooks. And so when I come home from work, before I get into the house, because the vent is on the stove, my entire yard is filled with the smell of browning onions. And so I'm not sure what she's cooking, because everything kind of starts off with a browning onion, right? So it could be like ground meat spaghetti, or it could be a gumbo. Like, I don't know what I'm going for, but I know it's going to be good, whatever it is. And so that smell, it's, we talk about sense of place, that smell brings me to my sense of place, which doesn't have to necessarily be a physical place. Like that's a part of it. And, Ida's been hard on our community. Like, it's been really difficult to put back the pieces. And what I realized, and again, we go back to food, but I needed this spring to happen in a way that I didn't know that I needed spring in a hurricane devastated area. because the thistles have started to come up, and the thistles are something that we harvest and eat, and they just grow in fields and around. And reconnecting to the experience of going out and harvesting that, but then seeing that and all of the devastation around us, the thistles are coming up again. And the blackberry, or well, they're dewberries, but like we all say that they're blackberries, even though they're dewberries, those flowers are blooming. And we know that the blackberries are coming, and we're gonna get together and pick blackberries and make dumplings. And so for me, it's about, I mean, it's about food, but it's about the feelings that are associated with harvesting that food, and knowing that it's all in a season, and those seasons are happening even after the devastation has taken place for hurricanes. So it kind of gives you a little bit of hope that, okay, if the thistles can do it, I could do it too, you know?
I think for me, the most straightforward connection I can make is to the one that we just watched, the process of kind of trying to maintain I think in the case of the Houma, it's palmetto baskets, but for my tribe, it's primarily pine needle and river cane baskets. So I can't even tell you which of the many hurricanes damaged those environments more. I know, for example, with Laura, Kisatchie was damaged, a great deal of land in Kisatchie was damaged. And tribal elders from my tribe used to take trips to Kisatchie Forest to harvest pine needles to make our traditional kashata baskets. And we now have to go to different places. We're not sure how much is left in the traditional lands that we used to harvest those kind of materials. So in sort of my realm of work, not only are we fighting against, just like all of you, not only are we fighting against the environment and the changing, especially the catastrophic weather events, but also it's a struggle in and of itself to maintain folkways, especially as younger people increasingly aren't picking up some of the traditional folkways like pine needle basket weaving and that sort of thing. So it's sort of a double-edged sword. It's a two-headed problem, and we have to address both at the same time, which makes the entire process much more complicated. But I take heart in knowing that there are young people learning our traditions, even in spite of the difficulties. Like Jonathan said, the process is continuing, even if it doesn't seem like it's going to, even if it becomes more difficult over time with the changing weather events and the tide of cultural change in general. I mean, I know I've spoken to a lot of Cajun friends, grown up around a lot of Cajuns, and I feel like in some ways, the Coushatta cultural experience, trying to preserve some of our folkways, not just our language, but also the traditions, it's a struggle we share very closely with our Cajun neighbors. So.
Yeah, and I think one of the most beautiful things that you and Jonathan are pointing to is, you know, like when you know such loss, when you've lived through hurricanes, you don't take anything for granted. When leaves start coming back on the trees, when the thistles start coming up, you know, it's beautiful in a way that you felt like you forgot, like you knew what beauty was. But, you know, one of the greatest tragedies with climate change is that extreme weather worsens the problems that have long existed in our cities and communities, which is why the most vulnerable individuals in society are usually the most impacted by flooding and pollution. And this is something that experts call environmental racism, which are those policies and practices that place low-income families and communities of color in lower-lying areas more prone to flooding, but then also in areas of high pollution, like around petrochemical plants and refineries. Joy, this is something you and I talked about on our phone call. So with that in mind, if you want to start us off, tell me about what you all perceive as the greatest threats to Louisiana communities and cultures, maybe including environmental racism, but not limited to it. And maybe consider how you've seen those threats evolve over the course of your lifetimes.
Well, yes, and I'm in St. John the Baptist Parish, and my parish is in the heart of what is being referred to as Cancer Alley. We have the highest risk of cancer in a 95th percentile in the country. So what we face is real, real danger and real risk every day. But also it's interesting, we talked about that, just kind of referring back to the last question about what does it mean to be a coastal parish? St. John Parish is not a coastal parish per se. So it was those coastal parishes that in the event of a storm, we call them the buffer parishes, because when the storm would come in, when we would, okay, it hit Houma, it hit Terrebonne and Lafourche Parish, that meant that the storm was going to weaken and start to speed up because it was over the water. Hurricane Ida, that didn't happen. It hit us, it did not weaken, it slowed down. And so 16, 17 hours later, we are still waiting for the storm to pass. And so we realized in the river parishes, and I include St. James and St. Charles, who are neighboring parishes, that we are the buffer parishes now, and then it made me feel like in that, to feel that flip where I'm like, I'm understanding what it's like to be that, the buffer parish, because it was like before, it was like, thank God there's somebody that's going to stop it before it hits us, hey, my prayers for you. But now we are those buffer parishes. And so I think just the ways in which we are discounting climate change and the impact that we're having on the environment. And also with Cancer Rally being synonymous with plantation country, which is a problematic name that our tourist commission uses. So this idea of extraction, and when we think about the plantation system, of course, we think about the brutality of the enslaved people who were indigenous, and the Africans that were forcibly brought in. But we forget the destruction and the violence that happened to nature. You had to clear tens and thousands, hundreds of thousands of acres of forested land. You had to, when it came to the river and the way that we had to, we fooled so much with the river, to accommodate commerce up and down the river. So just that those modes of extraction that we've seen is certainly at play in the culture that we have now. And so I just think that they're so synonymous, and with me as being part of a Black descendant community that is descended from the plantation that I work at. Thank God it's a museum of slavery, so it focuses on the experience of people like my ancestors. But just to see the ways in which we talk about sugarcane, and I have a softness in my heart for sugarcane. Because we used to go out into the field and you grab some sugar cane and you eat it. My big brothers would go find it and cut it up for us and eat it. So that's such the best thing in the world is to see my mom, who I just think she's the best sugar cane cutter in the world. She's so neat and proper with it. And I love seeing it, right? But when you think about that sugar cane, that's just as foreign as every other chemical that's being produced along the river. Louisiana is not, that's not an indigenous crop. It was brought in from Papua New Guinea. So to think about what had to happen to the environment to accommodate, and what had to happen, what happened to the people that was involved in that labor, who are still here. My ancestors have been here since the 1700s, but yeah, I think all of it is climate change, Cancer Rally, plantation country. It's all part of the same problem. And if we ignore even one of those components, then we ignore all of it, and then we all suffer.
I really resonate with a lot of those points. I think something important to remember is in the course of talking about climate change's destruction on the environment, it's not just coastal parishes. The parishes that I'm from are not coastal, but and this is sort of in reference to something you mentioned earlier, Megan. The name that my father actually invented that I'm sort of still using, Bayou Indian. So much of our culture is centered around living by the bayou, along the rivers, in the wetlands, in the lowlands. And those environments, just like Joe was saying, are not damaged just by climate change, but also by decisions that people made that weren't indigenous to this place and didn't understand the climate, didn't understand the environment, didn't understand the people living there. So, for example, so much logging and forestry destruction has happened in our indigenous environments that, like I was talking about earlier, it's harder to find the plants that are crucial to our folkways. Like the long needle pines is much harder to find in the areas that we used to look for. So in terms of your question, I think that something that isn't spoken about enough is the extractive industries, like Joy was talking about. It's not just one factor that is influencing all of this change. These are decisions often made by people, not people from here, like I say, but people that have power to use what isn't theirs for their own purposes, and it damages the communities that they're extracting from.
Well, and let me rephrase before we pitch it back to Keagan and Jonathan, because I think what Eli and Joy are kind of talking about is this idea of the buffer. And so like Eli, he said, I'm not really on the coastal parish, and Joy said the same thing. But like now, before you could count on a buffer, and like Joy's pointing out, not so much anymore. And Eli, I think you're pointing out that maybe that's because of some of these extractive industries. Pines were a buffer, but when they're not there anymore, the coast pushes further inland, hurricanes push further inland. So Keagan, Jonathan, do you have anything to add in terms of how you all have seen things evolve over your lifetimes?
Well, I'll say that, I think it's hard. Culture is strange in some ways, because I think when it's working well, when it's alive, we take it for granted. It's the nature of it. And I think that's one of the real threats that we have here with what we're facing is, and I think Joy sort of mentioned this about the buffer parishes. We take those things for granted. I mean, I'll just say personally, like I have always sort of taken Cameron Parish for granted. I knew it was there. I knew when I needed to go see a landscape that was beautiful or majestic, I could leave the city and drive down to Cameron. I knew there were people there making a life in Cameron. These resilient people, they're the ones who could live in this place that seems sort of impossible to live in, but there's people who have adapted to the place. I've taken that for granted. And I do think that's a real threat, that we need to be sort of very intentional about what we're going to do now and how we need to save things and the kind of things we need to sort of preserve and save. And I have seen in my own life a drastic change just locally about how people have moved from Cameron into Lake Charles and then north of Lake Charles up to Highway 190 where Eli is living. And I do think, there's populations in Lake Charles, the neighborhood, the Greenwich Terrace, that is prone to flooding. And so now, just recently, they decided they'll start a buyout program. Well, that neighborhood, of course, is a lower income neighborhood. I mean, it's of course very low. It would make sense. Well, you have to buy out these places to save them, but at the same time, that's a part of the culture that we're missing, right? It's gone, and we have to think about what that means to these places when we make those decisions. Can't take those things for granted.
So I think Joy gave me my multi-million-dollar idea, because I think we're gonna have bumper stickers now all in Terrebonne Parish and Southern Terrebonne about proud to be a buffer parish, because as you were saying that, this may be something that we all have to figure out, because this probably is not healthy, right? When you said that, I got a sense of pride, and I was like, you're right, I'm a buffer parish, and I'm gonna take it, and I'm gonna protect Joy, and I'm gonna protect everybody else, because we got this, because we Bayou people, because we're well, I don't even like the word resilient anymore, but like, we got this. But that's probably not healthy, that we're like sacrificing ourselves. I don't know, there's something more to that, and Joy, we may have to have a conversation about that later. With this question, I thought that many of us would go to, like, with climate change, what are the threats to culture? And immediately I went to, hurricanes are stronger, wetter, more frequent, but that's not where the majority of us went, which I think is interesting for that. And it's not where I'm really going to, because I think one of our biggest threats in our area is still our segregation and our idea of like, we're separate from each other, which will, divide and conquer kind of thing. and we cannot make it if we still view ourselves in these terms of us and them. And so like, how has that progressed? To answer your question, how have you seen that evolve? I think I am just now starting to see people say, oh, let's kind of think about that, because I think here in our community, it's never been something that we have addressed, and I feel like it's starting to happen. I feel like that divisive, I don't, even in the recovery of Hurricane Ida right now, there's still so much divisiveness, and you look at it and you say like, with our leadership from federal to local, you're like, we're not going to be able to make it unless we're able to come together on some common ground to figure out our problems. And so I hope we're able to do that.
Well, and I think we talked about this a little bit. I think the coming together has become more difficult because with past hurricanes, you could count on the damage being a little more spotty in communities so that, neighborhoods could gather together to help the few homes that were damaged or destroyed. But it wasn't every home on every street in the entire parish. So the big thing now is like, we do pride ourselves on being buffer parishes and being on the front lines of this climate change thing. We pride ourselves on helping someone else before we help ourselves. But when everyone across the board needs help, it's harder to come together. So I definitely do think, we need to keep thinking about this. We've identified cultural threats. So now let's try to match cultural preservation strategies to combat those threats. What can we do to pass our rich cultures onto future generations? And I think what makes answering that question particularly difficult is that we're trying to preserve something when everything, the land, the people, the cultures are shifting and migrating, whether that's transient migration, they'll move back after their homes are, rebuilt, or whether it's migration for good. So it's hard to preserve when things are shifting so quickly. And Eli, Keagan, if you want to start us off here, I'm thinking especially about the power of stories. What role do stories play in passing down who we are and what the places we call home mean?
Yeah, I wanted to add a few things onto the last points. I think, Jonathan, you made some really, really good points that I wanted to just address a little bit. Not so much in Lake Charles, we were never really considered a buffer parish or anything like that, obviously. But something that people did think, and I'm going to call myself out here, is that in the past, most hurricanes have hit the eastern part of the state. And so Laura and the other hurricanes not all of them, but I feel like we really avoided, in my hometown, we avoided so much damage, whereas New Orleans was completely destroyed and things like that. So there was just this sort of mindset that is East Louisiana's problem, and we're just not going to worry about it. Like, we'll send some Cajun Navy over and some supplies, but we're not really going to be affected, so we'll worry about it later. And Laura was a huge punch to the gut that showed us that nobody is immune from dealing with these kinds of problems. And I think that's something that we have to all come to acknowledge, is that if we're going to stay in Louisiana and fight for this state, we have to do it more cohesively across regions. The second thing is that I think it is interesting that people typically do talk about, at least us, we started off by talking about human actions as opposed to the catastrophic weather events, and obviously they're all connected, and we can obviously say that catastrophic events are because of human activity, but sort of as on a bigger scale that is harder for us to influence. But things like segregation, like you mentioned, things like extractive industries and who we allow to harvest the resources of our land, these are things that we can affect, whereas catastrophic weather events are harder to have an influence on. So I think, and then this relates to the third thing I wanted to respond to, which is that I don't know if our decision-making processes are going to be able to, as they currently stand, address these urgent issues. We have more and more devastating weather events more frequently every single year. And if we spend 5 years in committees, as is the American way, there is almost no chance, we have no chance to save our material resources. So that is something that we have to just wrestle with. I don't know what the solution is to that, but that is something that I feel, even as a young person, that we're sort of stuck in this repetitive cycle of debate and two sides, and we need to do something. I think we can all agree we need to do something. And now I'll answer your question briefly so I don't take up too much time. I think that at least, I know there are many different ways to approach cultural preservation, and lots of them are successful in their own ways. I think for us in the Coushatta tribe, the thing that we really wanted to focus on first was preserving the material that currently exists. So even though anthropologists, linguists, and other academics made efforts to categorize, for example, our language in the 20th century, the tribe itself had never made any attempts at least a structured attempt to come up with a common orthography, a dictionary, a phrase book, etc. So in 2007, when the Coushatta Heritage Project and the Coushatta Language Department began, we formed a language committee of elders and younger people and people of all ages who had an interest and a passion and a culture, and we hammered out an alphabet in a weekend. And that is one of the proudest accomplishments we have still. We have, and then we spent years coming up with a comprehensive dictionary as well as we could, and so on and so forth, and just creating the materials that we can, while the elders who possess this invaluable material and traditions in their heads are still around, because that is a real thing that all of our communities are dealing with, is that the knowledge that elders have is becoming harder and harder to keep, to maintain, to record. So if we can do that, then I think for us in our mindset, the next step was to teach young people and to teach people of all ages from the materials that we preserved. So at least if the enthusiasm or the desire to pick up these traditions isn't there, the material will be for whenever the time comes that people do take enough interest to fight for, to save their traditions. So that's my take.
Well, I'll just say something very briefly about stories, and I'll let Joy and Jonathan talk, because I do think they probably have some really practical hands-on experience about preserving culture that they should share. I would say that, in some ways, stories are, they can persuade us and they can connect us in ways that other things don't. I mean, they do something to our brains. And so I think when we think about culture, we often sort of ignore these intangible parts of culture because they're hard for us to grasp. They're hard for us to kind of hold on to. But those stories that we tell ourselves about ourselves and we tell other people are usually complex sort of histories and sort of testimonies about who we are and what we consider important values in the culture. So our stories are kind of good roadmaps about what we think are important. So I think that's a place to start with stories in particular. And then,
well, I'd love the idea of, I love stories, and so I think this is a great, great time for me to pitch in to kind of contribute, because just the love of stories is just so inspiring to me. So I see on Jonathan's wall, he has a poster of the Rougarou. We call him the Lougarou, but I'll excuse you, Jonathan. But one of the things that, I recently got a new puppy, and his name is Lougarou, Louis for short. And so those are the ways that we kind of preserve those stories, because I grew up with my grandparents and my family. My neighborhood is my family compound, and vice versa, which happens in a lot of Louisiana small communities. And so I grew up with such wonderful, wonderful storytelling tradition that I didn't realize I loved so much until I realized those were the happiest times of my life, listening to them. I'm sitting right now in the cafe that we call the Foret Cafe, which I think my people who are familiar with the Cajun culture understands, what the Foret is. But it's interesting, the Foret, and there's two different versions. The one that I grew up with is that the Foret was a witch. Now with the Cajun culture, Foret is the light that appears in the swamp that is a ghost, and it may or may not lead you to Jean Lafitte's treasure. Okay, I can't. That's the story. So now what was interesting, we have our cafe called the Foret. We have a definition of what it is. And we had a couple that came from Trinidad. And so they saw, our description of the Foret, which is the light in the swamp one, because I could never quite make the connection between why is our Foret a witch and why in Cajun culture it's more related to the swamp. Well, this couple from Trinidad, when we were talking about the stories, and for them, they had something very similar that was a swamp witch. And so I was like, and we have West Indian, heritage here. I have a family that came from either Trinidad or Haiti. And this couple said, my family's last name is Alexis. She's like, there's tons of Alexis in Trinidad. So I say that because by those stories, we were able to find out I was able to put together a big clue of my identity and of our culture. The fact that we had these two stories and that, that they had this difference and we talked about it, it filled in a gap, which as a Black person, when it comes down to tracing our history, there's a break. There's so much mystery that you have to solve, and that's tragic and it's unfortunate. But what I'm trying to capture and trying to promote is that there's such beauty, and there's such mystery and adventure that's part of the story, right? And and so just hearing someone talk about the thistle, we call it the chadron, and that's, you make the salad out of it, right? And so like these little cultural elements that you can like put together the pieces and connect the Cajun culture with the Creole culture. With us, we have a lot of West African influence. So compare Lapin, which is Brer Rabbit, or who's the grandfather of Bugs Bunny, what that means to understand who the trickster rabbit is, and to understand what resistance meant, and that the idea of the person in power, doesn't always have to be the person in power, and you have to be creative, right? And so all of those things just help us face, especially like going through what we're going through now. And just to circle back to what the buffer zone is, I want to just mention for for people who live in fence line communities, that buffer zone means something. It's the same thing, but it means how much room do you have between you and petrochemical or heavy industry. And right now, me and my nonprofit, we are suing the parish because our buffer zones are all over the and there's a grain terminal that's trying to locate on top of us. And our parish is saying, there is no buffer zone between us and heavy industry. But now I'm relying so much on those trickster, clever, being creative, forging your own path, not letting anyone tell you no. And so many of these stories are so intertwined with resistance, and power. So I am relating to them in a way and leaning on them a way that I never imagined that I would. And as stressful as this has been, this is the most fun that I've had, and the most I think connected spiritually to my ancestors and to my culture that I've been in my entire life. And you just kind of got to embrace, like when that fight is there for you, then like you can take that fight on, and you can win, and you can rely on your culture to do it.
So Joy, if you're looking for another trickster spirit, the lutin is another thing from the folklore that you can look up, and the lutin is a big trickster spirit that might be able to help y'all out with a lot.
Okay, I will definitely.
And I also want to say, like, after this is over, I want to have dinner with all the panelists, because like this is a great group of people that I've really enjoyed listening to, as well as talking with. One of the things for me is to acknowledge disruption. And by disruption, I'm talking about political unrest, hurricanes, alien abductions, TikTok videos that get in your way of so all of those things are disruptive and pull us away from things that used to be easy, which was passing on your traditions. Traditions got passed on to the next generation because that's what you had to do. You had to grow gardens and collect thistles and go trawling. And so that's just what your daily activities were. So now we're in a place with all this disruption and distraction that we have to approach our culture with intention. We have to pass these traditions down intentionally, because otherwise they won't get passed down. So it's important to identify what those traditions are that are important to you, and make a concerted effort and say, this is what I will do to transfer this tradition to future generations behind me. All that in recognizing that technology changes the way that we experience culture. Quick example is they used to dry shrimp on the docks in the sun, and then wear sacks on their feet and stomp it was called a shrimp dance, and stomp the dried shrimp to get the shells off. Later, there's like electric dryers and a tumbler. They taste the same, but the technology has improved, or made it, not gonna say improved, have made it different to make that process a little bit faster. And then I think of how is future technology going to enable us to experience that? And we look at Star Trek, and you see those food replicators, and there's going to be gumbo and potato salad replicated in a food replicator, and people are still going to be arguing about whether the potato salad goes in the gumbo or not, but it's going to be there. And we need to ensure that the essence of those traditions remains the same, whether it's being done by the sun, it's being done by an electric dryer, or if it's being done by a food replicator that doesn't exist yet. The essence has to remain the same. And it's going to be our people that we pass our traditions to that are going to be plugging that into the computer to say how the gumbo is supposed to taste, that is going to get that flavor right. You know what I'm saying? So that's that. Yeah, I'm going to get off my soapbox.
Well, okay, Jonathan, in one quick minute, can you tell everyone what you shared with me, what the Bayou Culture Collaborative is doing with these cultureware parties as like one really concrete way to preserve culture?
So we started off with a cultureware party that then turned into the Bayou Culture Collaborative that is now the Bayou Culture Gatherings, which like it's gotten into something really beautiful. Maida Owens, who works with the Louisiana Division of the Arts and the Louisiana Folklore Society, have done a wonderful job in developing that program. I invite everybody on this to seek that out and find out when the next gathering is going to be. It's on Zoom. And so the way that it started out was it's the idea behind a Tupperware party, right? But instead of selling plastic containers, we were selling culture. So we got a group of people together. We made a shrimp dip. And it was sort of that Amway, you come into somebody's house to buy Pampered Chef stuff, but we weren't selling anything except for our cultural traditions. And people left with the recipe for the shrimp dip, you know, and then we talked about and this is like a group of, you know, I'd say like 15, 20 people. And it was like, what's important to you? What should we preserve? The French language came up a lot, you know, wishing that could be something that we don't lose. And so it just spun off into a now wonderful program.
All right, so everyone in the audience, I'm going to challenge you to enter the Q&A and tell us what you would bring to a cultureware party. I'm going to ask one more question of our panelists. We have two great questions in the Q&A right now that I want to give to our panelists. So everyone take a minute, think about what questions you have and enter them in the Q&A, because here's my last one. Eli said something after becoming fluent in the Kawasati language that I think we'd all agree with. He said, "My story is a continuation of my people's story. I stand on the shoulder of giants." That quote has the idea that our ancestors and the traditions that have been passed down to us are what allow us to persist and keep going. But my greatest worry is that in this time of human accelerated climate change, are we facing something that our ancestors didn't face and thus couldn't prepare us for? Do our stories and traditions reach their limits when stuff's changing so rapidly? Eli, I'm kicking it to you first.
Thanks for the question. And I would be remiss and I would get in big trouble if I didn't touch on Coushatta storytelling. I'd slip my mind answering 3 questions that I invented for myself from what someone else said. But and if anyone is interested, not to plug my podcast too many times, but coming out with an episode tomorrow or Friday that has 4 Coushatta stories in it. We call them rabbit tales. So Joy and Jonathan both talked about trickster characters. This is another one to add to your mental collection. Our word for rabbit is chukfi, and the word for story is atlihilka. So we call them chukfa atlihilka, rabbit tales. And they don't always have to have rabbit, but typically they have many southeastern woodland characters, and rabbit is just the primary trickster, the one typically making the most mess, and so the stories are named after him. But I really like this angle, Megan, and I think that part of my understanding of how sort of these ancient traditions can be relevant in the modern day is that the messages and stories being passed down are not so specific that they can't be extrapolated into the modern day and into the future. Most of we call them aibachilka. It's like ways of living, rules for life, like how to be, basically. And a lot of the content that I get from stories I hear from elders is not just that, you know, these 2 animals talked to each other and argued and scared each other and ran away or whatever, but that like Joy was talking about, there are ways to overcome overwhelming power structures. These trickster characters in these stories are really common throughout marginalized communities all across the world, because we value things not just like raw strength or numbers, but wit and help from our allies and our ability to adapt to changing environments. So the Coushatta story is one, not that there's anything wrong with being a militaristic tribe, but Indians are typically thought of as these warlike people, and some were, and that's their tradition. But my tribe wasn't. My tribe were always diplomats. We were always go-betweens between other tribes, between the newly arrived European settlers, and we went between French and Spanish people in Louisiana and in the Southeast. These were not friendly people, so we must have had some talent in surviving and making it through these changing obstacles. Just in the last 500 years, we went through 4 or 5 different European nations to survive. We survived encroachment from other Indian tribes, and so on. And so some of these values are things that I think about daily. How do I make it in a world that wasn't designed for someone that looks like me, thinks like me, from where I'm from? And the Coushatta message is keep going, keep pushing, think about new solutions, think about ways to make it, because the world is not easy, nice, not going to help you. The world is going to be how it is, and climate change is, like we've talked about this whole hour, it's not something that we can control like that. All we can control is our reaction to it and the steps that we take to preserve these traditions in spite of those challenges we face. So, and this is the last point, is something that Jonathan said, is that the Coushatta stories are not just fun stories, but also transmitting invaluable linguistic material. My father says that was the primary way he learned the language when he was a young child, is sitting around the fire or the wooden stove or wherever else in the winter, especially listening to his uncles tell stories and tell different stories. He told me yesterday that sometimes there would be a storyteller on a bench or a stoop or something, and then there would be his brother next to him making sound effects and making noises, or just kind of enhancing the experience of listening to the story. So it was engaging and fun, and he learned the language. Especially in the realm of storytelling, there are things we say in everyday life, like, hey, how are you? Are you going to the supermarket or whatever? But stories can really get at more abstract things, or things that are less likely to happen in the real world. And if not for their inventive quality, we might literally lose words, phrases, entire parts of the language. So they are invaluable. And in my opinion, obviously I'm biased as a storyteller, they might be the most central portion of retaining these traditions. If we can retain the stories and the language, if we can retain the morals and the messages, then we can take those along into the future, no matter what the environment looks like, or the political, cultural, human climate that we find ourselves in.
Okay, I'm going to take a question from the Q&A from the audience to extend what I'm asking for the other panelists, because if what's on the table is about how our traditions and our ancestors prepare us for where we are now, Robert caught something that Jonathan said earlier, which is that Jonathan said he didn't much care for the term resilient. And we could maybe say, like, we as a culture, we specialize in being resilient. Why, can you expound on why you no longer care for the term resilient, is the question from the audience. And I would extend this to everyone as a continuation of, do our traditions make us resilient people, or is resiliency part of what we need to overcome, Jonathan?
So after Ida, we were involved a lot. Well, I was involved with an organization that did a lot of relief work. And so we're going into the communities, and I mean, people are living in tents and in makeshift structures and sleeping in their vehicles. And it was heartbreaking and depressing. And I looked at these people, and some would have said they're resilient. They're there, and they're going to rebuild. I mean, there was a man who was taking lumber from people who were throwing it away from structures that had collapsed to try to rebuild a place for him and his daughter to live. And we would say, because they're resilient. And then no, so like automatically, if you're poor and you don't have options and you're forced to rebuild with whatever you can find, that's resiliency. You should be proud of that. And I'm like, no, like I'm tired. Like, I mean, look, I think that, you know, it's a buzzword to write for grants and it's a program and we want to, and it sounds good. And I get the idea behind it. I do. And I don't know what word you'd use to replace it necessarily, right? So although I do like the word tenacious is the willingness to be the buffer, right? Tenacious means I am willing to take the hit and I'm gonna charge forth into the storm because I'm tenacious. But resilient just feels like, well, I ain't got no other choice than to be resilient. So I guess this is what I'm gonna do, you know, because I'll just figure it out. Maybe we're figuring it out is the new resilient. I don't know. It was this storm that made me feel very different about that word.
I'll jump in and just say, you know, it's funny because in Lake Charles, the phrase people are using is Louisiana strong. And I know exactly what you mean, Jonathan. And I think that word resilience, you know, is an important word as long as it's not a word that we use to fool ourselves, a word that's a trick. And if it means doing the same thing over and over again, then it's a real problem. And I think that's really where I'm at with the word too, Jonathan. I mean, I understand why it's a psychological tool and why it's important, but I think we have to be careful with what we interpret it to mean.
I don't use the word resilient anymore. I feel the same way with you all. And it's a word that used to come up a lot. You know, I'm at Whitney Plantation. We focus on the lives of the enslaved. And it's so easy to say, oh, there are people that were so resilient. Look how resilient they were. You know, first of all, they were surviving, you know, and second of all, like we are putting the onus on them to like, well, doesn't matter what happens to you, you got to be resilient, you know, so it doesn't ever put the responsibility on the system or the structure. Is just like it'll be magical for you, right? And so I think like we have like this magical Black people syndrome that we often get, like, you know, like, and it's a beautiful part. And I love, you know, the wonderful, you know, the amazing feats that, you know, my people have gone through and have managed, but it's like that they're not magical. They're people, they're human, you know, and when you, like you were saying, Jonathan, when that person had to find wood to rebuild their house, you're not taking into account the trauma that person was going through. You saw, you know, resilience. You don't know what that person was taking, you know, to do it. I think a better word, I use resourceful. You know, I use resourceful, and to me, that is like, you got the resources, you use it. But yeah, I stay away from that word because, again, it just paints a false picture. It puts a nice, pretty bow on something that's not pretty, is not real. And the responsibility is not ours to take your trauma. You know, it's not our responsibility. So I'm on the same page with the other panelists and using that word.
Yeah.
I want to add a few quick thoughts. I think that, first of all, I think the word is patronizing. It's like, good job, little Louisiana Bayou person, for surviving this tragic event. Like, I think we should use the word necessity more. Like, who said that it was our choice to stay here? Like, maybe it is, and I think a lot of people make that choice. But for a lot of people in a lot of communities, it's a necessity. We say, Yalifa istilka konami lahon. We will remain here long into the future. It's not an option to give up the land, to give up the folkways that come along with that. And to Joy's point, I think using the word resilience really is playing into this American mindset of like pulling yourself up by the bootstraps, and it changes it from, and everyone I think said something to this effect, it changes it from it being a societal responsibility and a collective responsibility that we should help these people to, look, they overcame it on their own, of their own free will, so we don't have any responsibility to help. And I think it's an easy distancing tool that people use, and I wish we could move away from it.
And it makes it all too easy not to pass, say, a federal aid relief package because the folks down there are resilient. 2 questions about coastal erosion specifically. So one from Rick is, how does the panel feel about the recent reports of accelerating sea level rise in the coastal culture? What would the adaptation strategy be? And then Carly asks if the Coalition to Restore Coastal Louisiana is helping to restore the coastline. So I think folks are maybe interested in what you all kind of know about coastal erosion and recent reports about sea level rise. I don't know if anyone has thoughts there.
I guess I'll jump in. CRCL, absolutely. I don't, obviously I'm not an employee or a spokesperson for the organization. I would encourage you guys to check out their website. But they definitely have some innovative programs. One, if memory serves me correctly, is about recycling oyster shells to be able to create a live barrier. If that's not your program, forgive me, but it's somebody's program. But I do believe that that's CRCL, and yes, they do. They are doing programs to work to restore the coast. And then the other is about sea level rise. I don't want to be on a panel like this. Now let me clarify that. I am honored to be on a panel like this, but it hurts me every time I have to talk about we may not be able to live here because of sea level rise. Tidal flooding may become an issue. It's not even going to be hurricanes that we have to worry about. It'll just be regular tidal flooding that will make it such a challenge to live here. And it hurts me to talk about those things. Is migration a resilient strategy, right? So maybe migration, here we go with the word resilience, forgive me, everybody. Is migration a strategy? And maybe that's gonna be what it is. But, and Megan, we talked about this too before about, retreating from the coast feels like failure. If we left here, or if you move, then you weren't strong enough to be able to tough it out, and and it feels like a weakness. But then on top of it, we don't want to move. I don't want to move. None of us want to move. We love living here. We love everything about this place. It gives me great anxiety to think about that. A lot of people are just not going to think about it. And it's just going to happen, and we will never acknowledge the moving that's going to happen. I think I don't know. Maybe that's just a human way of what's the stages of denial. I think there's a lot of denial, but I think that denial is because we are trying to preserve our emotional and mental health. Because none of us want to deal with this. None of us want to have to leave where we love. The short of it is, I don't know the answer to your question.
I could strike a more hopeful note about migration, I think, literally. It's sort of interesting talking about these problems, because it feels like our people groups go through similar difficulties at different times, and often it's different things that cause them. But like I was mentioning earlier, the history of my tribe is we were much further east. We were in Alabama, we were in the Tennessee River Valley area, long time. I mean, there are hundreds of or thousands of years old mound sites that we can directly trace ourselves back to. And it wasn't climate change that moved us, but human forces. We were never removed, on the Trail of Tears, which is what most people would know in terms of Indian removal. But we left right before that because we wanted to avoid that happening. And we moved from that area west to Texas, to North Louisiana, until eventually in the 1880s we settled in Bayou Blue around Kinder area. And we have stories talking about the hardship and the difficulty of traveling and migrating against our own will. And a lot of our collective strength and common history, it revolves around those feelings of anguish and anxiety. And in fact, only half of the tribe, my tribe, actually did migrate whenever we initially left the East. My tribe split into 3 different tribes in 3 different states. The Coushatta here, the Alabama Coushatta in Texas, and the Alabama Quasarti in Oklahoma. So not only did we have to move, but we were separated from each other by these things. But the hopeful note, that was sort of that's the part that we're kind of dreading, is having to, maybe change where we live. But the hopeful note is that we adapted our culture and our ways to more kind of come to allow us to take advantage of the new environment that we found ourselves in. So the Southwest Louisiana Bayou feels that, no living Coushatta was around at any time in which we lived somewhere else. So our culture has evolved to adapt to the new places that we find ourselves in. It's not a great solution, and it's not something that anyone should have to go through. But I just want to say that I think there can be hope at the end of that process, and there are ways to move forward and to maintain our cultures, even in spite of having to move for reasons that are beyond our control.
So we have time for one more question. So I'm going to try to merge 3 audience questions into one. Get ready. And then it'll be a quick fire of answers. It's really about, the question is generally about what folks who are in the audience tonight, who are participating in this conversation, what can they do after leaving this, webinar? How can they help preserve rich cultures? How can they spread the message? Jennifer from the audience was wondering specifically about, does anyone know of people recording oral histories from elders, and maybe is that a way to engage the youth in historical or cultural preservation? She says they know everything about videography, they can capture stories. So one way is like, who are we recruiting to help us with stories? But then another great question came from Ariel, which is also about thinking about possibly the erasure of stories and how to go back and tell different stories about history. And this one specifically for Joy about plants and chemical facilities around Cancer Alley being on former plantations. She was wondering, is that strategic to erase the stories of the enslaved experiences? So last question about what can folks do where they are and what's our impetus as human storytellers?
Well, and just it's an interesting question about the strategy for plantations and plants and the removal of that history. So in St. John the Baptist Parish, we have a marathon facility that is on the site of a former plantation. The big house is still there. The plant got into some hot water because we know that plants get industrial tax exemptions. And this plant had falsified records to exempt itself from those for having to pay taxes, and it was found to have done that. And so in St. John Parish, there was a group of people who who exposed this, made it transparent. And one of the things that, I had discussion with the group and we've been talking about the connection between plants and plantations and all, and that was brought up in that argument against that extractive facility. Well, it snowballed and has been snowballing for a while. We know that, plantation weddings over the last couple of years have been highly controversial. The marathon plant, as well as Shell, as well as other, so employees are pushing back and saying, I'm not going to your plantation for our company dinner anymore. I don't want to come work for you if you have a plantation on site. Oh, and by the way, there's people still buried, enslaved people still buried on the plantation inside your facility. So what Marathon, and it's really just a rumor now, but it's pretty much a almost confirmed rumor. They're literally trying to take the house and move it somewhere else, because it's like, well, you know what, we're tired of this, we're tired of the controversy, we're willing to take it, they just want to move it. And so those are talking about strategies. The reason why those plants are there is because of the land, the access, and all it went into the extractive economy. But they are doing things to erase enslavement and slavery from their corporations. And, we see different types of erasure. Just to right now, I didn't know that we have land next to us that has been established by the state as, Aboriginal Chitimacha land. And, so if it's here, then, it's Chitimacha land all over. So it's like, why are we just building stuff on one of the oldest, that's such an old nation. Like there's artifacts from thousands of years ago in the ground, and nobody is saying we need to preserve it because they want that land to be for some industrial facility, right? And so our erasure is tied to their economics. My ancestors are buried in those plantations. We can't get companies to admit that they are, but there's so much strategy, there's so much corruption. Our governments, local, state, are working together, all in the interest of petrochemical and heavy industry. And then the way they do it is by erasing us and erasing our existence. So.
I'll jump in if that's okay. Real quick, first, I want to thank Eli for bringing me back, because I left on a very desperate or depressing note. Let's go with that. And you said, like, let me offer you some hope. And I want to key in on that, because without hope, there is no reason for action. And so we always have to go back to that hopeful side, because without that, then there's no reason for us to do anything. And two, you talked about ancestors, movement, and everything like that. And I want to recognize that's a part of our human history. Like all of us, like we look back and it was just some miserable stuff that's happening. And we look back and we say, man, that was miserable. And then we look at us and like, well, that's miserable too. So like this, welcome to our lives, folks. We just got to make the best of it where we at right now. So thank you for that, Eli. I wanted to say on this last question that one of the things that we talk about at the Bayou Cultural Collaborative is it's a Native American idea of thinking of ourselves as future ancestors. And so with that thought, what would our great-grandchildren wish we would have done? And so when you're asking the question of like, what can we do? Ask yourself that question. What will my great-grandchildren wish that I would have done in this moment right now? And you answer your own question. Thanks.
And I'll just say that I think, people, if you look at the question and answers, they gave some solutions about things that they could do. I mean, I think there are opportunities out there. There are groups you can join. There are libraries who are trying to collect oral histories. The Bayou Cultural Collaborative is a group you can join. There are things you can do. And I think it's going to take various groups, sort of a grassroots movement where everyone is collaborating to do different sorts of things to protect culture and preserve it. So, I mean, that's what I would suggest is, like you said, Jonathan, think about what is most important to you, and then find a group and work with them, because there's power in numbers. And I know that's.
I'm sorry. Can I just add, and with preserving these stories and preserving it, it's so easy to preserve a story. And just like coming back to our cafe that. Again, like I said, I grew up with those stories from my grandparents and my great uncle. By the way, his narrative was recorded and is now used as part of Whitney's tour. He was there during a rice farming, and he still remembered at 93 years old, every single part of the process. So he's just, a cultural gem. But me and my sister, we love those stories so much. They gave us such warmth, and we wanted, when visitors came here, to have that same warmth. And so what we were like, well, what can we do? So people we want to know, we named the cafe the Fee-Fo-Lay after what our grandmother told us. So how can we evoke it? And I handmade trail signs, to go in the front yard of the cafe. I mean, I figured out I have no artistic abilities whatsoever, but I made a trail sign that had all the little stories that meant so much to me and my sister. And when I tell you that's the best feeling in the world, to see people, we have beignets here, they're eating beignets, drinking their coffee, and they're lined up around this handmade trail sign that, that we made. And so it's it was for $100, I think. So there's really simple ways of you capturing those stories, but it's being intentional, I think someone said, and recognizing the magic in those stories. And not everyone has those magical tales, or they don't have yours. They may have theirs, and you can learn theirs. But if you don't put it out there and stuff, if you don't verbalize it, if you don't manifest it, then nobody is going to see those stories, including your descendants. So it's very easy. I think tap into your creative spirits. That's where those stories came from, and find out ways in which you can again display those stories and have them accessible for people. And it can be very, very simple, but just do it.
No pressure, Eli, but do you want the last word?
Yeah, I have so many things to say, so I'm just gonna talk for another hour. If you guys can hang around, that'd be great. But no, there's a bunch of different things that I wanted to touch on before we end, so I hope I can capture them all. But the first thing is, Joy, you mentioned remains being held in corporate facilities or by companies, and you mentioned was it the Chitamacha? Am I remembering that right? Yeah. And I just want to say, from the Indian perspective, that there is work being done from tribes, especially in the Southeast now. There's a great effort being made with NAGPRA and through various other avenues to repatriate some of the graves that have been claimed by academic institutions, by companies, by various entities that don't own them and have no right to them. And something that, and I have no expertise on the subject, but I would think that at some point that process shouldn't be limited only to Native Americans, because there are other groups in this country that have claims like that, legitimate claims to human remains are sacred. And this is not something that we can sacrifice to the American corporate machine. It's just not something that we can compromise on. So I hope that there's more collaboration in the future and there are more ways for people to get at those. And in terms of the question about actually preserving some of this material, especially as young people, I just have to talk a little bit about my experience learning the Coushatta language. We took an immersion class in the summer when I was 17, about to turn 18, I think. And after that immersion class, which lasted about a month or two, I spent every day for several months, the rest of the summer, going around to as many elders as would allow me into their homes in the community. And I like to think that they wanted to see me, or it would have been fun. But I know it can be a chore, especially when I was trying to speak to them in broken Coushatta, and they were correcting me in real time and telling me stories, and there was people going between and stuff. But I just remember this sense of belonging and of joy and of the need to work sitting with these elders, because they seemed hungry, voracious to pass on these stories to me and to help me with the language. And I think that young people would be surprised how willing their elders are to share that material with them. And like the question asker mentioned, we have phones, we have even if you don't think, I always stress this to people, because I hear sometimes, you have such a cool history and your culture is so interesting or whatever, but you don't have to have what is considered a cool or in vogue culture to capture your own family's history. Like Jonathan said, your descendants will want to know that. And I remember, I'm half Jewish, and there were stories that I never met my grandmother, and there were stories about her and things about her that I wanted to know. So I remember sitting down with my family for like 8 total hours over 3 days on a Zoom call and just recording every single thing that they could remember about her, so that I would be able to tell my children or grandchildren what their great and great grandmother was like and how we can't forget that example, and so on. And so anybody can do it. We all have the technology to do it. And I think the easiest thing for people to do is, it's no one's responsibility to fight another culture's battle, but you can fight your own battle in your own way for your own family's history. And it's important to carry those traditions on too. There is no one gender, there's no one race or ethnicity or background that is necessarily like much more important than another. It's all important to us because of what it means in our own personal context. So I don't think people should be discouraged from making those efforts on their own. And the last thing I want to say is just that kind of what I've been touching on all night is that the line from elders to young people is a straight line, and we shouldn't have to dance so much around this idea that kids have a terrible attention span. They do. I do. we all do, I think, now more than we used to. But I think kids are also willing and open to the idea. So it can't just be only the young people that are making the effort. I think everybody of any age has to make an effort in some respect to pass on these traditions. It can't just be, because I know I was that young person that wasn't as maybe interested as I should have been or whatever, that was chastised. And I remember thinking, y'all haven't offered or told me that you wanted me to do this. You just kind of admonish me when I don't. So I think collaborating between ages and age groups is our greatest weapon in engaging with some of these cultural preservation and historical preservation endeavors. So I hope that we're able to do that long into the future.
Yeah, maybe what we all do, everyone in the audience included, is vow that this conversation does not end here. And as Keagan and Jonathan, Joy and Eli show us, there are so many groups having these conversations. Find what's worth saving in your culture and in your family, and make that happen. Be part of saving what makes Louisiana great and beautiful. Panelists, I invite you to stay, open that Q&A box and see how much love the audience has been pouring all over you. There's been a rich discussion about gumbo that I couldn't share, so it's worth your time to read. We're grateful to everyone in the audience who took the time out of your evening to be part of this conversation tonight. Should you want to revisit the conversation or share it with your loved ones, a recording of the program will be available at 64parishes.org later this week. Finally, allow me to say thanks again to 64 Parishes and the Louisiana Endowment for the Humanities for hosting us tonight. We appreciate all you do for the arts and humanities. We wouldn't be here without it. And that's it, everybody. Thanks for coming.